ministry or that ministry, and whenever they got a chance, they had to go take a break and go hit the golf course or do whatever they needed to do to get away. And then the last field that they would ever get to tend was the field of their family, and it was destroying their kids. Even closer to home is that field of our heart. That there's a spiritual field within us, and that's the field of our heart. The Bible talks about, even Jesus spoke the parable of the sower, that going out and sowing seeds. And he speaks of the heart as a soil, as a ground. And if in such, that soil needs to be tended, needs to be cared for, needs to be maintained. As heart is a garden, it's a field, and it must be maintained and cared for, lest it grow overgrown with the nettles and the thorns and all that junk that sucks life out of us. Jesus also spoke of the parable of the talents. And he said, and in that story we see an illustration that by how we tend our fields, we will be judged. We will be judged by how we tend our fields. And you can say, well, that's just, those are talents. Those aren't, that guy didn't give them fields, but he gave them something. He gave them a charge over something. And the man gave them a talent, gave them a charge, and that charge, that talent became their field. And as you look at that parable, you see that at the end, each man was given a talent, and each man was judged by what he did with that talent, how he tended that field. And one put it in, as Pastor preached that sermon, stuffed it down and wrapped it up in a napkin, hid it, put it away, and he was judged according that field never became fruitful, never produced anything, never profited in any way. And so he was judged according to that. And then this aspect that our physical fields are a reflection of our spiritual fields. That condition of our heart was the condition of my heart was why I was able to make so many excuses why I couldn't clean my truck. That physical field of my truck was a reflection of my heart and where my heart was at, a laziness. Well, Daniel, you're not lazy. You went to work every day, and I'd come home, and it's too cold to go out and clean my truck. So I'll get to it when the weather gets warmer. And then the weather would get warmer, and I'd been working all day, and it's been warm weather, and I said longer daylight, so I worked more, and the last thing I got to do is get home and clean my truck. And then the weather gets hot, and it's too hot to clean my truck. And then the weather gets cold again, and it's too cold to clean my truck. And see how I'm working. I just can't get to it. And it was reflecting the condition, the care that I was giving my own heart was in the same manner, never getting around to tending and caring for that field, and it was being made visible and known and seen in that physical realm. And the condition of our fields will reflect our effort and diligence in tending them. A field does not tend itself. This parable clearly says that idea that if the field is left untended, it will quickly become overgrown and unfruitful, useless. I don't know how many of you noticed in the springtime, I came in one day and this whole back lot was all plowed, all tilled. And I saw it and I was like, well, that's curious. I wonder why they did that. And I talked to Pastor. At the time, I thought that was our property, so I was like really curious, like why is somebody tilling our property? I didn't realize it wasn't. That property belongs to the campground, I believe, out back, and they don't currently use it for anything, but they don't want it to become overgrown. They don't want it to turn into forest. And so they'll go out there occasionally and till it in order to destroy all the brush that's beginning to grow, the small saplings and trees that are beginning to grow, all that stuff that's starting to take over the field and turn the field into a forest, and go through and they'll till it in order to destroy all that and let it just grow up as grass again. But if they didn't do that, it would quickly become a forest. I had the opportunity this past week to do a lot of hiking through the woods, and we climbed Mount Washington, and Laura drove up, and they give you that little CD so you can listen to it on your way up, and they tell you about what you're seeing and all that. And of course, I didn't listen to a CD on my way up, but so I figured, well, I'll listen to it on the way home. And so we're riding home, and I'm listening to the CD, and I found it curious. In one hand, they give you these warnings that you got to stay on the rocks. Don't walk on the grass. It's a fragile environment. We don't want to damage it so that the next people who come can see it just like it is in the natural. And if everybody just walks wherever to kill everything, so stay on the trails, stay on the rocks. And a few minutes later, they're telling about back in the 1800s when the loggers came in and clear-cut the whole land, everything gone. And they said, luckily, it's all grown back like it used to be, just like it used to be. And I was like, well, that seems contradictory. How am I walking on the grass going to destroy it forever? But they could cut everything down. And a little off track, but I found that very curious. But I also found that whole idea that they said, that idea that it had all been once clear-cut, that it was the whole place cleared, all the logs timbered, all taken off. And even as we hiked the trail, one of the trails we hiked on, crossing way out in the middle of the woods, mountains, they're bridges, steel bridges with planks on them for skidders to go across, where the old logging road used to go. And I'm marveling as I'm walking, climbing over boulders as big as houses, like, how did a logger ever drive out here? I can't for the life of me figure it out. But that whole idea that once had been cleared, but now it's all grown in. The time when untended, just left to grow, it'll quickly turn into a forest. So does the condition of our hearts. So does the condition of our families. So does 80 Main Street if it's not constantly cared for and tended. And so does my pickup. If it's not, it can easily. I'm amazed how I can clean, especially with kids, I think, how I can clean my pickup, and it only takes one trip somewhere, and it's ready for it cleaning again. It's amazing. And I can tell them when you get in the car, you take everything you brought in you with, they'll get in there with their little ice pops or whatever, and it'll be like, make sure you take that wrapper out with you. And sure enough, I'm cleaning my truck this weekend, and sure enough, there's all the wrappers and pulling them all out. And, but it requires that constant care and maintenance. Otherwise, it quickly becomes, I'm amazed how fast it can become a disaster once again. The next is in this idea that was place, the next is preparation. Fields take preparation, starting with that idea of the forest. As we hiked through the woods, we saw these great forests, and I don't know how many of you like to hike. I enjoy it, getting out into the woods. And the most exhilarating part is when you get up above the tree line and you're out in the rocks, and you can see for miles. But in order to get there, I noticed you have to hike through the woods. There's no way around it, unless you take the auto road. But you got to hike through the woods, and as we're hiking through the woods, it's amazing how thick it is off the trail. You get all the fallen trees and the brush everywhere growing. You got to stay on the trail. If you get off the trail, you're A, going to get lost, and B, you're going to get all cut up and scratched from trying to move through the brush, and it's going to be a very uncomfortable and awkward position. But you got to remember, every field you see, and many of us can drive down the road and we can see these old farmers' fields. You can drive them. Everybody knows what they look like because they can see the stone walls that used to mark the edges of the field. And you can see the fields, but every single one of those fields used to be a forest. Pastor talks about even his own home on Lover's Lane, that the first day standing at the edge of the woods, and there was nothing. It was just nothing but fallen timber and trees and a disaster, and having to go in there and begin clearing. And each one of you, or most of you, not me, enjoyed on Wednesday the bonfire that he had over there in that nice new backyard, and took a great deal of maintenance and care and clearing and work to get to that point to be able to have that field. Fields start as forests, and they must be cleared. In our lives, this clearing preparation, I kind of related it to those things on the surface. As you go in, you look at that forest, and you see all the trees, and especially up in the north, you see the rocks. I marvel how you walk out in the woods, and there's a boulder the size of a house, and you're like, how did that get there? These rocks and trees everywhere, and you got to come in and start clearing and cutting and removing all that stuff, and you burn the brush and cut the trees and clear the rocks. This would be the surface things. Many of the surface things in our lives are related to things like music, movies, TV shows, reading, things we listen to, things we spend our time on, that are cluttering that field of our heart, things that are taking up space and not allowing the sunlight to penetrate, and not allowing the ground to have space to be able to plant and be able to be productive. And I also related this idea that it's easy to kind of look at our lives and say, especially a new believer comes to the Lord and they're all caught up in all sorts of lifestyles that are unholy and unrighteous, and you can easily say, well, that tree's got to go, that tree's got to go. It's pretty easy. But a lot of those trees I found are not necessarily evil. that we wouldn't look at it on the tree and say, well, that's evil, that's got to go. But there's simply things that are cluttering and taking up space in the field, not allowing it to be used for what its purpose is. And these things will clutter and choke off the life or the purpose of that field. I associated in my own life my testimony with baseball. Baseball used to take a great deal of my time. It consumed me. I remember the Lord put a call on my life, and I professed that I believe the Lord's called me into ministry, and I began to take some studies, Berean studies. It was a home correspondence Bible education course that I began to study. And I remember at the time I had shut off the television, and I was able to dedicate all kinds of time to my studies. And I got my first course, and I did it relatively quickly and completed it and bought the second course. Well, at the same time, I began to I had turned the TV back on and started watching a little baseball. And I love baseball. I enjoy it immensely and find it incredibly relaxing. I just enjoy all the aspects of the game. And so I would find myself sitting at my desk and listening. I'd turn the TV on behind me, and I just listened to the game. And that was okay. And I'd still be doing my work, so I'm good, right? But then it wasn't long before I'm turned around sitting on the couch with my work in my lap. I'm watching the game as I'm trying to do my work. Of course, now it's taking a little bit longer. And before I know it, my work's sitting on the desk, and I'm just laid out on the couch, passed out, watching the game. And there's nothing innately evil about baseball, but it's that it came to that point to where I realized that baseball had to go, and it had to be cut off. And that was a tree in that field that had to be cut and rooted out. And I marvel at it today that here, once that baseball had such a grip on me that it was a tree in my field, it was an entertainment that had to be cut out of my life. And yet now today, the Lord's put me on a baseball team, that baseball, what once entertains me, is now a work that he's given me. It's now what once was cluttering my field is now my field to tend. And how marvelous it is that the Lord does that work in our lives. So these things aren't always evil, and these things often come. This clearing is always a bit of a process. That the Lord doesn't just come in with his great big massive crew and his great big equipment and just down it all goes and all ready for the till. It takes a while, and it often comes in stages. I joke all the time about the movies and purging our movies, our DVDs, and that process that the Lord brought us through. We'd go through all our DVDs and we'd clean them all out, and this one's got to go, and this one's got to go, and then we'd be all set. And then some time would pass, and the Lord would bring us back to that stack of DVDs again, and a whole new batch would go. And I always marveled how my batch always seemed to be different than somebody else's batch, that the Lord was working on them, and because the Lord's working on different aspects of our field at different times of our lives, and it was a matter of conscience, where the Lord had brought to our conscience that this is not holy, this is not good for you. Maybe it's not that it's not holy, but it's consuming time that you should be spending elsewhere, and you're not tending or caring for things that you ought to be caring for. So it's a tree that needs to go. So because I have something greater for you, I have something greater for your field than growing firewood. After the field has been cleared of the debris, the rocks, the trees, the brush, everything that's in it, then there comes this process of plowing. This is a difficult one. Because plowing, to me, I thought of this idea that, sometimes removing these aspects from my lives, these surface things, it's not always comfortable, it's not always easy. I don't always want to give this up, I don't want to give that up, but I can do that. But the plowing aspect goes much deeper than that, because it cuts down into the soil. It comes close to home. And plowing takes the soil and turns it over, and it exposes everything that's underneath. Plowing turns up the nasty things. It turns up and exposes and reveals what was hidden underground. I noticed in my own life, and I've noticed in others' lives, that how something happens when the plow begins to come through your life, that things that once seemed perfectly fine and perfectly normal all of a sudden don't anymore. Things are revealed, and all of a sudden you begin to see things that maybe attitudes, maybe ambitions that you had, pride, you'll see vanity, you'll You'll see hatred. You'll see unforgiveness. When that plow begins to carve through our lives, it begins turning over things. And just picture that plow cutting through the open field. And I don't know how many of you have seen them. I would assume most people have seen those old metal plows with that curved blade. And it's got a round blade in front of it. And you get a farmer behind the plow, and he begins, that plow gets pulled through, whether by a tractor or by a mule, and it plows through, and it carves through the ground, and it just takes the soil and just flips it over. And what was underneath is now all the grubs, all the worms, all the bugs, all the roots. It's all sticking up out. And just visualize that in our minds. And that's why so many people often run, as soon as the Lord begins putting his plow into their lives, and all of a sudden that's exposed. Not just for me to see, not just for you to see, but for all to see. And everybody sees it, and we say, whoa, let's flip that back over. I'm out of here. I noticed in my kids what really helped me kind of grasp this idea was it seemed like as soon as I began to plow in my kids' lives, that in this field that is my kids, all of a sudden all kinds of stuff started turning up. Laura and I are banging our heads against the wall saying, what happened? What's going on? We couldn't understand it. What are we doing wrong? Are we doing something wrong? It was at the same time we had put him in school and questioning maybe we've made a terrible mistake. This influences school. What is going on? And all of a sudden one day it just hit me. Right out of the blue, it just struck me. I've been plowing. And these things have been in them all along, but all of a sudden are being exposed for what they really are. And how easy it is to say, well, let's back up and say, I don't want to touch that. I don't want to go there. It's too much work. It's too ugly. I don't want to deal with it. It makes me feel bad. It makes them feel, and let's not touch. Let's just put the soil back and be done with it. I like a nice grassy field. We don't need to plant any fruit. But friends, Christ gives us a warning, and he says this, that the man who puts his hand to the plow and turns back is not worthy of the kingdom of God. That there's a danger when we begin plowing the field and don't finish it and don't complete it. Think of that your neighborhood. How many Christians have gone out into their neighborhood, move into town, bring a loaf of bread to all their new neighbors, profess, I know Jesus. You need Jesus in your life. And some time goes on, and before you know it, there's a dispute, a bickering between the neighbors. They don't like each other in hatred. And what have they just done but destroyed their witness from Christ? And that's why it's so important that once we begin putting our hands to that plow, once we make that stand and say, I'm plowing this field, that we never take our hand off the plow, because it destroys lives when we do. When we begin turning that life, we've cut into somebody's life, we've opened them up, and then we've left it, and it destroys lives. Thirdly, I have purpose. And this one's pretty straightforward, but bears going over, that idea of what is this field for? Why have I put all this work into the field? Why am I tilling? Why did I go through that whole process of taking the axe to the tree, putting the bar to those rocks, all that work into this, plowing the field? Because a field has purpose. Fields are meant to produce something. God didn't put us on this earth just to live and just to get through our life and to die and go on. He's given us purpose in life. He's created a field in us. He's created in us, as I said before, we're not here on this earth. This field is for something more valuable, more important, more goes beyond than just producing firewood. God has a fruit to produce. Our fields are intended, our purpose, to be fruitful. My family has not been given to me just so that I can have some young kid to play baseball with, that I can go out and have some fun in the yard, that I have somebody to ride a bicycle with. My family's been given to me for a purpose, and that purpose is to be fruitful. So why do we then not tend them and not keep them? Why do we not raise our families and say, I'm going after what God has for us, that God has me here where I'm at right now for a purpose, and He has a plan for my family, and I'm going to go after that fruit. All fields produce something. Even that forest, before it was cleared and tended, was producing something, producing pine cones, producing brush, producing havens for all the bugs and the grubs and all the nasty stuff that in life, providing a hiding place for all the beasts of the field, it was producing something. All fields produce something. What we tend according to the natural will yield according to the natural. I can, as I said earlier, that I can tend this field of family in the natural realm, as many, many people do, and sadly many Christians do, that I'm just raising up kids. I want good kids. I want my kids to be okay. I want them to be polite. I want them to be nice. I want that pat on the back that says you're doing a good job as a father, and I want my kids to go off to college. I want them to score that nice job. I want them to go have their nice family, and that's good for me. And as long as everybody sees that they're good kids and not bad kids, that we're good with that. But the Lord doesn't have that for our families. He has us to, as parents, He's called us to raise up godly men and women of God who are fruitful in the kingdom. That my children are not just kids, they're the next generation of men and women of God that are going to go out and produce and tend their fields as the Lord gives them fields. What we tend according to the spiritual will yield in the eternal. That I can either tend and farm in the natural order and I'll produce the natural, or I can tend and farm in the spiritual. And what I'm doing is I'm setting my eyes on the eternal, saying that there's something that goes far beyond what eyes can see and what hands can touch. There's something in the eternal kingdom of God that I'm after. I'm after an eternal fruit. I'm after my kids going and facing the Lord, and my kids hearing that, well done, good and faithful servant. That's what we're after. We're not after just getting them to church and getting them to Sunday school. We're after that day when they draw their last breath and when they meet the Lord and the Lord says to them, good and faithful servant. And we're after their kids and their kids' kids. Fruitfulness, however, requires faithfulness. It takes time. Are we in it for the long haul? How many of us tend to go through spells, and I've certainly been as guilty as any of them, of going through spells in my life where I begin to put my hand to the plow and I begin to tend and to work at it, and time begins to go on and I begin to become weary of it, and things arise and I start getting distracted by this and distracted by that, and I don't see the fruit coming forth, and I put my head, start scratching my head and say, is this really worth it? And I begin going my own way, but fruitfulness requires faithfulness. If we're ever going to see the fruit in our children's lives, if we're ever going to see the fruit in our lives, if we're ever going to see the fruit in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our work, it's going to require a faithfulness for the long haul. Even after a field has been cleared, plowed, and sown, it's still not immediately fruitful. It takes time for those seeds to germinate and to sprout and to put down a root, to bud, to flower, to grow some more, before they finally begin to produce a fruit. And even that fruit is for a season. And you can plant your garden and it begins to produce that fruit, but all of a sudden the fruit wanes and it doesn't seem fruitful anymore. Well, there's another season coming. It's called winter. And spring's coming, though. And we got to keep tending and tilling and plowing and doing that work of farming that field, or if it's ever to remain fruitful, because the moment we stop is the moment the nettles and the thorns begin to make their move back into our fields. A farmer must be patient. It also requires maintenance. That idea, like this field back here, that you can't just leave the field to sit or it quickly becomes the forest. Once the field has been cleared, it will quickly grow into the most mangled and tangled mess unless it's been maintained. Hence that idea, once no one having put his hand to the plow and turning back is worthy of the kingdom of God. Lastly, I have position. Let's look at that verse 31 again real quick. And this is one that really got me to thinking in a lot of more broader aspects of how this field relates to my life. Verse 31, and there it was, all overgrown with thorns. Its surface was covered with nettles. Its stone wall was broken down. And when I saw it, I considered it... I went too far. Its stone wall was broken down. How many of us can tell a field without a border? These fields have borders. They have walls that have been set up. We're very familiar with it here in New England as the farmers used to tend their fields. They used to say that the New England produces nothing better than rocks. the farmer can farm rocks as well as he can farm anything, because what would happen is they'd go and they'd clear a field, and they'd take all the rocks and they'd push them all off to the side and kind of pile them up, and they'd till that field, and they'd plow it and plant it and put it in and harvest it, and then snow would come, and then spring would come, and they'd go to plow it again. There's a whole new batch of rocks under the snow, and they'd clear those off and push it aside, and eventually those walls began to grow up, because during the winter that frost would get underneath the rocks and begin pushing them to the surface, and constantly these rocks were coming to the surface. And so we drive, and we still see evidence all around us these days in New England of the rock walls that formed around all the fields. And it's important to recognize and realize that fields have boundaries. Fields need to have boundaries. And just as the farmer's field had boundaries, those walls noted who owned the field. I could tell Bob's field from Joe's field easily by that wall. And even today, much of our residential properties have been divided out according to where those old farmers' fields' walls were. And those walls continue to remain as boundaries between properties. Those boundaries, though, served the purpose of marking and delineating the field. Whose field was it? Where was the field? As I pondered that whole idea, I began to realize, and it occurred to me, this idea that my fields have boundaries, and how easy it is sometimes to go outside of the boundaries of my field. I don't recognize the boundaries of my field, and I begin farming and tending in someone else's field, and is oftentimes why my own field at home gets neglected. It's because I'm so busy tending another's field that I haven't left time or energy to tend my own. The Lord has given us certain fields in our lives, and he's marked them off and set their boundaries and said, this is your field. My family is my field. I've often marveled at how sometimes as families, larger families, begin to think that they have some sort of right over each other's children. Well, this cousin, they have the right to see this cousin, and the grandparents have the right to see this kid. Parents, your children are your field. You're the one that's ultimately responsible for them, and you need to keep them in your field. And remember that the Lord has given you a charge over your children and said, that's your field. Tend it. Even ministries can do it, where ministries, people